Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Sim Sundays podcast. This one is a special episode. This is actually a recording from a panel talk I was invited to host in London last week. I was joined by Tobin Leigh, our previous guest, and Kieran Holmes-Darby, who is head of gaming at Formula E. Now, our task was to, in front of the audience at the Power Up event held by the Esports Award, our task was to discuss the importance of communities for brands that are using gaming as a marketing activation. So it was a little bit corporate, a little bit commercial, but there's some interesting bits in there. There's especially some interesting bits from Kieran about how Formula E are creating communities within gaming to grow their fan base for the Real World Series. And of course, we had Tobin Leigh, who, if you listened to the last episode, you'll know all about. He was discussing how he had used and created communities in the past for the brands that he's worked with at Veloce and Quadrant. So yeah, buckle in.
Okay, right. So we're going to chat about building successful esports communities, why it's important, what works, what doesn't work. And to discuss that, we got three people who have done a bit in esports community building. So we've got Tobin, as you heard, who has managed Formula One esports teams. And then we've got Kieran, who's obviously gaming director at Formula E. We're going to discuss the importance of community for Formula E. And then myself, Tom, and we're going to just do a quick introduction and then get into some questions. So I'm Tom. I'm founder of a company called Grid Finder. We're an online community management platform for sim racing or online racing communities. So we have over 3,000 communities on our platform, and we let them list on our platform and find drivers. So drivers can go on the platform and say, I want to race PC, Formula One, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and I'm in Europe. And then we show them the dozens of communities that will facilitate those that racing for them. We also have a community management platform that allows the online community managers to create racing calendars, collect results, standings, and we have a marketplace that allows people to trade and sell liveries, coaching, engineering setups, etc. So it's quite a broad remit that exists within online racing communities. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of people who take it very, very seriously, and so it's a lot of fun. Kieran.
Thanks. Yeah, I had quite a glowing intro before getting on stage. I suppose to build on that a little bit. My background is in esports, so I spent just over 7 years building XL Esports, one of the UK's leading gaming entertainment brands. Co-founded that with my brother in 2015. Learned a lot. And I've now been at Formula E for the past year, essentially as like an in-house gaming consultant, so helping build any opportunities you get to be a part of a genuinely new sport. Like Formula E is in its 9th season. I'd say probably outside of like UFC and paddle now, there's not many like genuinely new sports that are experiencing growth. So yeah, great to be at Formula E and helping them expand their audience through gaming.
Great, Tobin.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Tobin. And to be honest, I didn't actually hear my intro, so because I was a bit busy, frankly, putting on my mic. But basically, my background is I started off when I was like 17. Presumably, some others in here did too, as a professional esports player. And basically, I played Forza. You know, it was a great game back in the day, and it was just something I enjoyed. And basically, because I enjoyed it, I ended up getting involved in the esports space through just gaming. And I actually wanted to be a real race car driver, but I couldn't afford it. So my whole story was I was basically shown that games solved the issue of having no cash when it comes to motorsport, and gaming was that path. And basically after competing, I went and worked basically with Veloce Esports, which is a leading like esports company, and I was an account manager there, looking after McLaren Shadow and McLaren's esports operations, and also was working with the team that built Quadrant, which is F1 driver Lando Norris's gaming and lifestyle brand. And so basically, using all these experiences, I decided at the start of this year that it would be a fun idea to go out and just do my own thing. And that's what PaceNote is, which is my first new business, which is all about enabling brands to come into esports, and we just provide like everything that they could need to have a team or do a tournament or whatever they want to do. We would work with them to make it happen. So yeah, fingers crossed.
Great. Okay, so I think just from looking around the room and looking at Alice, I think one of the exciting things about esports and online racing and gaming communities is that it's really, really new. Sim racing especially kind of saw its huge boom, its explosion during COVID, like a lot of esports did. And so the kind of the industry experts, because the industry is so young, actually those kind of industry experts, the people who are leading the field, are actually very young. So you get kind of very new creative ideas coming through, which I think is particularly exciting. So we're going to dive into a little bit about Kieran, Tobin's and mine experience in building communities and how those communities can help brands. And there is a bit of a slant towards brands using gaming as a marketing activation and the importance of community in marketing and how gaming feeds into that. So Kieran, start with you. So how important is building an engaged gaming community for Formula E?
Yeah, so I'll just track this what we're about to say with my background is in, I've dubbed a new term traditional esports. Like we always talk about traditional sports when we're talking about esports, but now I'm, firmly in the sim racing community. I had to find a term for all of the other esports stuff I did before finding sim racing. So I'm relatively new to the sim racing world, but in terms like more broadly, esports have a fair amount of experience. And the way I suppose we look at building communities, I'll talk about Formula E specifically. When we're doing gaming activations, esports activation, everything we do is to either, it's like the ARM models, retain or monetize the fan base, right? Monetize are necessary. We're not as interested in that. Formula E is doing extremely well commercially and is not really trying to do any like D2C monetization stuff. So it's more about attract and retaining the fan base. So we do a lot of stuff in licensing, so getting Formula E IP into existing video games, not just racing games, trying to expand it into any game that has a genuine fan base that we think might be relevant for Formula E. So that's really licensing and the attraction side. But in terms of community building, that's on the sort of retention side. And that's all of our owned and operated products. So whether that's our esports proposition, which is Formula E Accelerate, where we run a sim racing championship, we also do a lot of like influencer-led stuff in there, or whether that's actually building our own video game, or whether that's just an in-app experience to get people to have skin in the game with Formula E, so like a little fantasy product, predictor product, whatever. So there's a lot in that retention side for me that is all about just keeping people coming back to the sport, not just on race weekends, but actually during the week and sort of across the year. And to get them from attract to retain and actually start building a community, that's all about conversion, and that's all about solidly integrated marketing campaigns across the business. So.
Yeah, I mean that it's really interesting that using the ARM model for attract. Now there's other methods of attracting and retaining users or fans. So what is it about gaming that makes it so effective? Like what is gaming's strengths when it comes to attracting and retaining users and fans?
Yeah, so I think naturally Formula E is going after a much younger audience than most sports. So Formula E is looking at what we dub the electric generation, people who are growing up with electric cars.
Mic check.
I've got quite a loud voice.
Project.
I'll try this when they finally turn it on. But if not, I'm just going to speak really loudly. What were we talking about?
So I was saying that you were saying that gaming is particularly good at retaining fans and users. Now, what I was suggesting is that there's other ways of doing that with social media, Google Ads, etc. There's
Correct.
Ways of attracting and retaining users. There's a lot of companies will use community apps. You've probably seen it a lot where your favorite esports team or your favorite football team or pace racing team has a community app where you get behind the scenes exclusive content. But why is gaming more effective?
So, we're flying. I think the way that we look at it is gaming is just another marketing medium. So it's not necessarily a replacement for all those things that you just said. But it's an additional marketing medium for Formula E to go and attract and retain a fan base. I think what I was saying is, given the audience is skews younger, it's the electric generation. From data that we receive, there's a lot of gamers in that target audience. There's also a lot of gamers in our retained audience. So we know that that's a medium that they're already engaging with. And then, there's a lot in gaming is quite a broad term, right? So there's a lot you can do there, but if you go the whole hog and actually create a video game, you can create what I believe is probably the most immersive experience you can have with a brand, and something that, genuinely adds value. That's what we're always looking to do. Is coming from the esports world, I don't necessarily think like brand first, or I think player first. And anything we do, it's all about how can we add value to the player? How can we add value to the community? Because if you do that, then you'll build, genuine trust and loyalty with the player base that you're trying to engage with.
And the interesting thing about sim racing is that it's unique within the esports sphere, in that it's kind of one-to-one related to something it's trying to emulate, right? So if you're a sim racer, you're sat in a chair with a wheel and pedals. Obviously, you can race as a controller, but a lot of people aspire to get their Logitech or Thrustmaster wheels. So it's kind of one-to-one. It's immersive, and that's kind of the strength there, is that it's so engaging for a fan. So as a fan of Formula E, you can become a Formula E racer. Now, if you're playing something like FIFA, you might be a huge, I'm going to say Newcastle fan, but you're not really playing as the Newcastle players are playing, because they're running around and you're sat on a controller, right? So it's totally immersive. And that's kind of in terms of online racing as an esport, that's its strength and its weakness, right? So it's one-to-one, which is great for immersion if you're participating in it, but it's not so great in terms of viewership, because what you're watching is either motorsport or almost motorsport, in the sense that you could go and watch real Formula E, or you could watch almost Formula E. So Tobin, I'm going to throw this one to you. Obviously, you've done quite a lot of work with F1 teams in creating teams that then participate. The point being that people will go and watch those teams racing online. What have you seen that has worked and hasn't worked from your perspective when you've been kind of pushing the idea of engaging fans through esports with Formula One?
Yeah, well, I think it's a good question. And to be honest, I think that this question about, like, essentially essentially the question you're asking is, why would a brand actually bother coming into esports and gaming in the first place? And to be honest, a lot of people don't immediately know. They just know that it's like worth doing because people have told them that it's worth doing. Yeah. But essentially the way that I kind of explain it, and to be honest, is what my business is kind of built on people trying to understand as well, is that by being involved in esports and having gaming elements to your business, it's like it just allows you to essentially just appeal to that kind of unique, like tech savvy younger audience. I think that is ultimately like what matters, because you watch like YouTubers like Mr. Beast, for example, people grow up with creators and people grow up with, talent and different industry trends. And I think that, if you really look at the kind of numbers of the industry and stuff, it's like, I just feel like everything's leading to it being at the start of something that could really accelerate, no pun intended, being, accelerate into the future. And so that side of things, and in terms of bringing brands in, and then once they get that they are appeasing to that next level of kind of audience that's growing, then the community comes with that. And then also, big part of that is from a commercial point of view, a lot of if we take sim racing as like an example from within esports, all these drivers and players are so they're so hardcore into their market that they're just worth a lot to brands, a lot more than I think people often realize. And so often I find that people are just quite pleasantly surprised if you can get a product out in front of people, then people genuinely will really cater towards that if it's good. But yeah, you did mention what didn't work so far, and not much really, but it is just the whole getting the story across, and and making sure that people understand really of like the fact that esports is also not that cheap. It's probably more expensive than people imagine, like when they're coming into it for the first time, depending on what niche you have. And so it's just setting expectations early, really, and then community and everything else just flows from there, really.
Just one thing to add on, I thought you made a really good point before you throw it over to Tobin around sim racing specifically, and this is something I've kind of had to get to grips with, is coming from the world of, League of Legends. Not many people can shoot fireballs out of their hands, but, when you're a good sim racer, theoretically, you're a good driver as well, right? So there's a lot of, it's almost like sim racing sits in its own bucket of esports and needs to kind of be treated in that way. And it does give it some incredible strengths, which allows us to do things like take a gaming arena of 20 simulators around to every race that we go to and give fans probably the most immersive experience they'll have with Formula E, and the closest they'll ever get to driving a Formula E car. Now, the problem, the kind of cons, is if they want to then go home and do that, then you rig and the barrier to entry, all right, it's not as high as going and being in karting or something and real racing, but it's still a pretty big barrier to entry. I mean, to put it into perspective, I could have a free sim rig in my house right now because I work for Formula E. I can't fit it anywhere. I live in a 2-bed flat in London. Where's it going to go? So there is kind of like barriers to entry for sim racing, which makes it hard to engage en masse. But it means that when you do an activation, you can give people a really, really immersive experience, and they generally have a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. So Gridfire has its own sim racing team. We race in the SRO series, SRO GQ World Time. We were in Monza a couple of weeks ago, and then out in a month, another ring in Barcelona. And the drivers are inside the race weekend. Now, the really interesting thing that happens alongside that is the real world racing series has a sim series alongside it. So there are drivers allocated from each of the real world teams, or the physical cars going around the track on the weekend, who will come and sim race in in this case, the Fanatec arena, and they can actually earn points for the real world series. Now, I suppose the side-by-side comparison was, could you imagine if in the Premier League, each of the teams had an esports team where for 2 or 3 games a year, you could have your esports team competing and they could win actual points in the Premier League? Well, sim racing is doing it because it's unique in the sense that it is so...
There's crossover, right? But the best FIFA player in the world, it might be terrible at football.
Yeah, and I probably want the best CSGO player to join the SAS anytime soon. It's be pretty challenging. So just we'll just go back to the commercial side of this. So Tobin, you worked for Quadrant for quite a long time. Now Quadrant, if you don't know, is Lando Norris, the Formula One driver. His brand. Now it started off, he was doing a lot of streaming, a lot of sim racing, and then he kind of went more broadly into gaming. And they've been hugely successful. So what can you tell us about working at Quadrant? That what was the secret sauce there? What was it that they unlocked that a lot of the larger kind of older brands hadn't worked out yet?
Yeah, well, I think Quadrant was really unique because essentially like that brand was built off of having this figurehead, Lando Norris, spearheading everything. He was well known on Twitch anyway for like streaming during lockdown. Maybe some of you have watched Lando mucking about on a sim rig at some point, especially in lockdown, as I said. But Quadrant was like quite a powerful brand, a very powerful brand, to be honest, because he, as like a figurehead, actually really cared about gaming and about everything that they were doing. And that was huge because it meant that he would turn up and he'd be on Discord and like film gaming sessions and stuff with all our other creators that we had. And Lando like loved it. And I think when a figurehead and like the person that the brand is all about essentially is so passionate about it, it just trundled down and everyone loved it. And it was a very hyped place to be, I guess. And I think that is actually like the magic. It's like if people really enjoy it, then I think that shines through. Yeah, I
think so at Gridfinder, what we're doing is we're kind of using our platform to go to brands who want to engage gamers and saying, right, you can create a branded community where people who have been to your venue or they've interacted with your product or bought your product, based on that, using that single thread of familiarity, they can join these gaming communities and then they can get to know each other as users of whatever your brand is. And the interesting thing about esports and sim racing and kind of gaming as a marketing activation is that it's about participation. So rather than seeing an advert or a video or content online where you're very passive, if you engage your fans through gaming, then they are engaging with the brand in a much more immersive way, because they're doing something, they're being something, and they're creating real relationships with the other people who are engaging with your brand. It's emotive, right? So if you so we have some brands that we're working with to create communities at the moment, and what we're saying to them is, if we create this Wednesday night series, the following day is very unlikely, if you have a Facebook advertising campaign, that somebody's going to say, "Oh, did you see any great adverts last night? Oh yeah, I saw this great advert on Facebook. The video was really interesting." That just doesn't happen. We're just so immune to it. Whereas if you engage with a brand through gaming, the following day you might say, "Oh, I had a great race last night with the insert brand here championship," or whatever. Okay, so you create these really positive emotional experiences, but you attach your brand to that positivity. And I think emotion, when it's kind of attached to a brand, is far more powerful. So you can really extend the shelf life of your brand loyalty if you use gaming as a marketing activation. And there's lots of platforms now that are out there to do that. So I would argue that for, when you're going to clients now and you're saying, "Look, we can create an esports team," it's because you can create these communities of people who can get involved and actually do something, be something within the remit of that brand. And for Formula E, you can say, "Come and be a Formula E driver." And if you feel like, I'm a sim racer myself, and the first time I kind of got the hang of DRS and ERS on the sim rig at home, it was a tiny little kind of 200-pound little rig thing. I was like, I get it now. I get it. And when I watched Formula One, I was like, I totally understand that corner. I can't believe you overtook there. That's nuts, because now I'm an expert because I've done it, right? And that's kind of the power of gaming as a marketing activation.
100%. Yeah, I mean, that when we do these gaming arenas and we take them around to the races, it's amazing the level of immersion you can give someone if they literally race on the track, on the day that they're about to watch people race on. It gives them so much more insight and so much more, I suppose, affinity with the brand, because they've had that, they really feel like they're knowledgeable. That might be the first time they've ever sat on a sim rig, but even just having like a couple of laps around a track gives you so much more insight when you actually watch the sport. And I don't think motorsport is the most accessible sport. I mean, yes, essentially it's just cars going around a track really fast, but to actually start to understand some of the technicalities around it, if you can give people that immersive experience, they're going to build such more loyalty with the brand. So that's what we try and do, and try and do it en masse. So we use other games to do that. So we use our licensing relationships with other games to try and hit a mass audience. The weird thing is, and I don't really have an answer to this, but the weird bit is, when we're doing these licensing agreements, we appreciate that sometimes that will be someone's first experience of Formula E. They may have never watched a race, they may have never heard of Formula E. Potentially they've probably heard of Formula One, but they probably don't know much about it. How far can you get someone down the fan funnel through a gaming experience? I don't really have an answer. I just think that, from, as you were saying, an advert might get someone to click on it, and you'll count that as, conversion and retention and engagement, but that hasn't really given them anything, any stickiness with the brand. Whereas if you attract someone through gaming, I'm going to hypothesize that they're going to be a lot further down the fan funnel once they've had that experience, and much more likely to hang around as a fan and build loyalty with the brand.
Yeah, absolutely. And I use this, I kind of use this analogy quite a lot. So I have this sounds like a shameless plug, but honestly, I promise it's related. But I have a sim racing podcast called Sim Sundays, where we talk about the business of sim racing. And every week I get a different guest who comes on, and they talk about their journey and their kind of entrepreneur journey, the startup journey, and kind of we talk about sim racing, how it's growing, and kind of what they're doing in that space. And I always say to them, so we have sponsors on the podcast, and they'll say, "Well, how many views have you had? How many listens have you had?" So it's so many thousand. It's like, "Oh, well, I can, for a tenner, I can get 10,000 views on TikTok." But it's kind of the difference between short form content on TikTok, where you see something for 10 seconds, and then a podcast. Podcast advertising is absolutely booming, because people who listen to a podcast for 45 minutes, they feel genuinely related to the hosts and to the guests, because they're listening to them for a lot longer. And that's why podcast advertising is doing so well. I would argue that gaming is kind of the same, in that you're engaging somebody in a far more meaningful, emotive way. And so your ROI on those, even if you get a tenth of the number of people engaging with it, especially gaming, right? So let's say you create a Formula E community, and you get people to race there. Now, let's say you have 10 million fans, maybe only 1 million of them actually regular gamers. And so it's a much smaller group. But what you're doing, I think, by using gaming as a marketing activation is you're creating super fans. Like genuinely, I didn't follow Formula One. I thought it was right. So given what I'm doing now, it pains me to admit this, but when I was a kid and I watched Formula One at my granddad's house, I was like, oh, it's boring, granddad. It's just cars going round and round in circles and the camera angles all the same, which is, I don't know where they are, it's dull. Then I played the game in 2011 and I got absolutely hooked, because now the corners weren't just bits of road that the cars were going past, they all had their own characters. And I became totally immersed in the world through gaming, and now I'm the biggest F1 fan ever from the game. So I think you're totally right.
Well, just don't worry, because Formula One racing is still boring, but Formula E racing isn't. So if anyone wants to watch Formula E race, it's much shorter. There's like way more overtakes. Shameless plug.
No,
actually, in Monaco, the next week, Monaco Formula One. Let's have a look how many overtakes there are in that Monaco race. Yeah. By the way, in the Formula E race in Monaco 2 weeks ago that I was at, there were 100. So
right. Formula E is available on all good streaming platforms. Great. Well, thank you very much for listening. It's been fun. It's been fun chatting about using esports as a marketing activation. And I think sim racing is kind of unique and gives its own little challenges and advantages. So thank you for joining me on the panel.
Just a final note, congratulations to Tobin on his new entrepreneurial venture with PaceNote, because that takes a lot of kahunas to dive into. So yeah, wish you all the best, mate.
So huge thanks to Tobin and Kieran for joining me on that panel, and thanks to Power Up and Esports Awards for inviting me to host a panel. It was a lot of fun. There was a really cool audience there. Got to meet some really cool people doing some really interesting stuff in sim racing. A couple of interesting conversations. Well, actually, a lot of interesting conversations with some brands that were there in Grid Finder. So watch this space. Thank you, as always, to our podcast sponsor, Track Racer. And if you want to find Sim Sundays for the next episode, make sure you follow or subscribe or whatever on Spotify, Google, Apple Podcasts, and of course, we're still doing the YouTube videos on our YouTube channel. So thanks for listening.